The first thing he changed was the schedule. I opened the shared calendar and my name wasn't there anymore. The plans were still active, I just wasn't included. Nothing dramatic happened that day. That's why I remember it. The first thing he changed was the morning schedule. I noticed it on a normal weekday, while the apartment was still quiet. We used to leave together at the same time without discussing it. That day, he was already dressed when I woke up and moving carefully. His coffee cup was empty and rinsed, placed upside down on the rack. I assumed he had an early meeting and didn't ask anything. Later, I saw a calendar notification disappear from the shared account. It wasn't deleted entirely, just no longer visible to me. I refreshed the app twice, thinking it was a sync issue. The rest of the morning followed its usual pattern without interruption. Messages were polite, brief, informational, like notes left on a desk. Nothing suggested intention, conflict, or distance, so I logged it quietly. At the time, it registered as a practical adjustment, not a decision. People change routines all the time for reasons that don't involve you. I repeated that thought while locking the door and walking to work. I didn't think it mattered at first, and that felt accurate then. It kept happening, always the same way. I would notice a small change and register it without reaction. Meetings moved earlier, messages shortened, decisions finalized before I arrived. None of it announced itself as exclusion. It looked like efficiency, like someone streamlining a process. When I spoke, he listened. When I finished, the direction stayed unchanged. I began writing things down privately, not as evidence, just as memory. Dates, times, what was decided, who was present. The notes stayed factual and brief. Over weeks, the list grew without variation. The sequence repeated with mechanical consistency. Suggestion, acknowledgement, continuation without adjustment. There was no resistance to respond to, and nothing to confront. Each instance alone was insignificant. Together they formed a quiet outline. I noticed my questions were answered, never expanded. Information was delivered only after it became irreversible. I stopped interrupting the flow. Silence required less correction. The household functioned smoothly under this arrangement. Schedules aligned perfectly with his needs. Mine adjusted around them automatically. I did not feel ignored. I felt processed. It kept happening, always the same way. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The pattern didn't announce itself all at once. It clarified slowly through repetition that no longer felt accidental. I stopped asking whether I was imagining things. The question became irrelevant. What mattered was consistency. Every adjustment pointed in the same direction. My presence no longer altered outcomes. Plans existed independently of my awareness. I learned about them after they were completed, never before. That detail stayed constant. There was no concealment involved. If I asked, he explained calmly, as if briefing someone external. His tone never shifted. It wasn't defensive or dismissive. It was procedural. I realized that inclusion had been replaced with notification. I was no longer part of the decision loop. I was an endpoint. The system didn't need my input to function. It accounted for me only as a variable to work around. That understanding arrived without emotion. It felt technical, almost neutral, like recognizing a process map that no longer contains your role. Once identified, it became visible everywhere, in conversations, in timing, in how space was allocated. Nothing dramatic confirmed it. The absence of contradiction did. I adjusted my routine, not abruptly and not to make a point. I stopped offering availability in advance. I planned my days without checking alignment first. When decisions were already made, I accepted them as final. There was no benefit in reacting. Reaction implied expectation, and expectation no longer applied. I noticed how quickly the environment adapted. Nothing stalled. Nothing required clarification. My absence from the process created no delays. That confirmed the shift more clearly than any conversation could have. I moved through shared spaces with less intention. I used what I needed and left the rest untouched. My schedule became self-contained. Meals happened separately without discussion. Evenings overlapped without intersecting. The arrangement felt stable, predictable. I understood that stability had replaced connection. It didn't feel hostile. It felt complete. There was nothing left to negotiate. When he spoke, I listened without interpreting subtext. When he didn't, I didn't fill the silence. The pressure I used to feel began to dissipate. Clarity has that effect. Once you stop trying to be included, exclusion loses its edge. I adjusted my routine, and everything continued as designed. Nothing changed. That was the point. The days continued with the same structure they had before. There were no confrontations, no clarifications, no formal endings. The environment remained calm and functional. I noticed that this stability depended on my lack of interference. As long as I didn't ask to be included, everything moved efficiently. I paid attention to how little effort was required from me now. My role had narrowed to presence without influence. I existed alongside decisions, not within them. That distinction settled quietly into place. I stopped anticipating moments where I might be consulted. The anticipation itself had been the source of tension. Without it, the silence felt neutral, not heavy, not dramatic, just empty of expectation. I recognized that whatever shift had occurred was already complete. There was nothing left to uncover or confirm. The pattern no longer needed monitoring. It had proven itself through consistency. I understood that staying required no action from me. Leaving would require one. I did neither. I remained where I was, aware of the boundaries. Control didn't come from changing the situation. It came from seeing it accurately and responding accordingly. Nothing changed. That was the point. I started noticing how little explanation was required anymore. Questions that once felt necessary no longer formed, not because answers were available, but because they were irrelevant. I observed my own behavior the way you watch a system stabilize. Inputs reduced, outputs remained consistent. The structure no longer depended on my engagement. I was present, but not consulted, and that distinction held steady. I noticed it in how time was allocated. Mornings unfolded without coordination. Evenings overlapped without intention. We shared space, not direction. There was no discomfort in it once I stopped resisting the configuration. Resistance implied an alternative still existed. It didn't. The process had already settled into its final form. I paid attention to details instead of meanings. Doors opening and closing, lights turned off without comment, schedules updating without notification. Each action reinforced the same conclusion. Nothing was being taken away, nothing was being added. I had simply been moved outside the operational core. That realization didn't demand a response. It required acknowledgement. Once acknowledged, it stopped pressing against me. The quiet felt intentional, not empty. I began to feel a different kind of control settle in. Not control over him or the situation. Control over my own responses and expectations. I stopped preparing explanations that were never requested. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. The energy I used to spend anticipating outcomes stayed unused. It accumulated quietly and made things lighter. I noticed how rarely my absence was remarked on. No confusion followed when I wasn't present. No adjustments were required. The system compensated without hesitation. That told me everything I needed to know. I was no longer a component. I was background. Once that became clear, my attention shifted inward. I watched my habits detach from shared timelines. Meals followed hunger instead of schedules. Sleep followed fatigue instead of compromise. Time became personal again. I didn't announce these changes. There was no need to mark them. They didn't disrupt anything external. They only reduced internal friction. I understood then that participation had already ended. What remained was proximity, not involvement. That distinction felt precise, clean, accurate. I accepted it without negotiation silently. There was no final moment to reference, no sentence that closed anything explicitly. The transition had already been completed through repetition. I noticed that nothing new was required from me to maintain stability. As long as I remained predictable, the structure held. Predictability replaced connection without friction. I began to see how long this had been in progress. Not weeks, longer than that. I had mistaken continuity for inclusion, They are not the same thing. Continuity only requires presence. Inclusion requires consideration. The second had been removed quietly. I stopped checking shared spaces for signs of relevance. Calendars updated without my input. Messages arrived only when outcomes were fixed. The timing never varied. That consistency removed doubt. There was nothing left to interpret. I wasn't waiting to be brought back in. There was no inside anymore. Just parallel routines occupying the same environment. I noticed how calm everything felt once I stopped labeling it as loss. Nothing had been taken abruptly. The process had been gradual and efficient. I had simply reached the point where denial no longer served a function. Recognition settled without resistance and stayed. I stopped trying to remember when it started. The exact point didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the structure no longer depended on me. I noticed how little effort it took to remain where I was. No decisions required my confirmation. No plans waited for my response. I existed in the margins without resistance. That position felt strangely stable, not temporary, not unresolved, finished. I understood that whatever role I thought I still had was historical. It belonged to an earlier version of the system. The current one functioned without it. Once that became clear, the tension dissolved. There was nothing to fix and nothing to recover, only a position to recognize. I stayed quiet because quiet was already built in. Nothing changed after that, and nothing needed to. The days continued, predictable and efficient. I moved through them without expecting inclusion. That expectation had been the last remaining attachment. Once it was gone, the silence felt accurate. Not empty, not heavy, just precise. I wasn't waiting for an ending. The ending had already happened quietly, over time. All that remained was awareness. I kept it to myself. Control didn't come from leaving or confronting. It came from seeing the structure clearly and adjusting without noise. The story ends here because there's nothing left to uncover, only a reality that no longer requires my participation.